rejection of traditional American values and radicalized political and cultural ideology was an integral and well-remembered part of 1960s life. A central part of our collective memory of the counterculture and its participants is, of course, drugs. Marijuana, hallucinogens such as LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and a variety of other drugs were not only used in the counterculture, they were in many instances advocated. Although drug use constitutes part of our image of the counterculture, not much attention has been devoted in recent times to what this drug use actually meant. Was it simply an empty action devoid of any significance, or did drug use suggest something deeper? When one examines primary sources from the era, it becomes clear that the latter is more accurate. Drug use stood for a range of social, cultural, and political attitudes, both for the counterculture and those outside of it. Beginning in the 1930s, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and its chairman, Harry J. Anslinger, spread sensationalized reports of violent acts and sexual deviancy that occurred as a result of drug use, especially marijuana, and therefore cast the drug user as immoral. In the 1960s, however, the rise of the counterculture movement would signal a fundamental shift in the dialogue on drug use, since for the first time, a coherent ideology extolling the use of drugs was adopted by the countercultural youth and expanded to a national level. Members of the counterculture perceived drugs as tools and symbols of spiritual enlightenment and of rebellion against the straight world. Drug use in the 1960s was a form of social expression that communicated a rejection of American societal norms, especially the dominant narratives on the dangers of drug use, and signified a moral breakdown for many outside of the counterculture, a sentiment that often mirrored the traditional dialogue on drug use that had grown out of the 1930s. At best, historical works on the counterculture have given the social meanings of drug use a cursory examination. Much has been written about the civil rights movements of the 1960s, the anti-Vietnam protests, and other forms of social upheaval, but no real focus is placed on drug use as a topic in and of itself in the context of this time period. Some histories of 1960s America mention drug use and the centrality of the counterculture movement, such as John C. McWilliams' Drug Use in American History, but do not specifically engage in any meaningful analysis of why it was central to the image of the counterculture or what it meant in that context. It's possible that historians have not considered drug use a topic of enough significance to give it their full attention, or perhaps the continuing social stigma attached to drug use is the reason for its marginalization as a serious historical topic. Whatever the case, the topic of drug use as a symbolic action with implicit social meaning in the 1960s has not received the level of attention that it deserves. In order to understand how the social meanings of drug use were contested or reinforced in the 1960s, one must examine the crafting of the image of the drug user as a social other that occurred in the 1930s. The central agent in crafting the drug user as a dangerous social other was Harry J. Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Throughout the 1930s, regional anxieties over certain racial and socioeconomic groups were blended with fears of drug users to create the image of the user as a dangerous social other capable of great depravity and violence. In his testimony before Congress between April 27th and May 4th, 1937, Anslinger forged a direct link between marijuana and criminality, claiming that the drug was dangerous to the mind and body, and particularly dangerous to the criminal type, because it releases all the inhibitions. As part of this evidence, Anslinger submitted a number of testimonies from prohibition advocates. In one such testament, the editor of a Colorado newspaper expressed anxiety over how a small marijuana cigarette was causing criminal behavior among the degenerate Spanish-speaking residents. Anslinger later alleged that there are 100,000 total marijuana use smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. And later asserted that the primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races. It's almost kind of Although many in the medical and scientific communities decried Anslinger's claims, most notably Alfred R. Lindersmith, they were generally well received by the rest of society. By the 1950s, Anslinger and the Bureau had convinced Congress that a get-tough approach to the drug problem was the solution, which resulted in harsher penalties for drug use. The FBN under Anslinger was thus an influential actor that solidified the perceived link between minorities, crime, and marijuana, a perception that would be adopted by officials and the public at large. These developments in the dialogue and legal approach to drug use would remain into the 1960s and had a significant impact on the way society viewed drug use in that decade. Drug use in the 1960s was an integral part of the overall rejection of traditional social values inherent in counterculture ideology. In a 1969 Time magazine article, one commentator wrote that drugs challenge the whole structure of adult values and represent a persistent unwillingness of youth to accept the straight world. An independent Star News columnist reported that drug use was a massive repudiation of the mores and morality of our society, against the gray flannel suit corporation mind, against what they see as a grossly materialistic and hypocritical society. Besides simply challenging this traditional culture, drug use promoted the questioning of it and encouraged a reappraisal. It was part of the hippies' withdrawal from society and simultaneously a critique of it. As an editorial in the Annals of Internal Medicine put it, the hippies were asking us to re-examine the conventions, the rigidities, and the hypocrisies of a materialistic way of life that many in the counterculture saw as the root of the social problems of the 60s. Thus, the user persists in taking drugs for the same reason he resists other edicts handed down from the heights of parenthood or school administration, because he rejects their authority to do so. Drugs symbolize this breakdown between the generations and the gap between young and old, and the use of drugs was therefore symptomatic of this breakdown in communications between the generations. Thus, drug use was political, and a symbolic action intended to have social meaning. Drug use also made a statement about what was and what was not acceptable as far as intoxicants were concerned. Except for the Prohibition era, alcohol enjoyed a status of general acceptance in American culture, and during the 1940s and 50s, prescription drugs, mainly antidepressants and stimulants, were used in increasing rates by various members of society, ranging from businessmen to housewives. Illegal drugs, especially marijuana and later hallucinogens such as mescaline and LSD, obviously enjoyed no such status, and rather were strongly vilified by drug prohibition advocates. Indeed, discussion of socially disapproved or illegal drugs usually conveys the impression that any, if not all, use is abusive and constitutes addiction, while discussion of more socially acceptable drugs such as alcohol and nicotine usually imply that almost all use, including abusive and addictive use, is normal. As Fred Davis and Laura Munoz asserted in a 1968 article in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, it was not only frequently asserted by many hippies that there is nothing wrong with certain drugs, chiefly marijuana and LSD, along with a number of other hallucinogens, or that their use is less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, but these drugs are positively beneficial. Thus, the counterculture's embrace of these drugs was also a statement condemning the uneven treatment of alcohol versus other drugs, and the dominant dialogue emanating from the 1930s that vilified users of certain drugs while ignoring others. It was a rejection of a hypocritical adult world and the so-called adult cult of booze that said it's all right to get high on some things but not on others. In many instances, members of the counterculture attempted to legitimize drug use by framing it as a form of religious experience in which drugs provided an avenue into alternative forms of consciousness that would allow deep spiritual insight. This form of rebranding by the counterculture grew mostly from the Beat Generation writers and poets such as Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William Burroughs, and academics such as Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary, who affirmed the possibilities of new religious meaning to be found in mystical experience, hallucinogenic drugs, and Asian religions. Branding psychedelic drug use as a tool for reaching a higher plateau of existence was widely accepted by many countercultural youth. Lisa Bieberman, a member of one such segment of youth, reflected that within the drug culture, many saw hallucinogens as the key to a stronger, richer human life that was going to save the world. Although Timothy Leary was not the first to advocate or at least suggest the use of psychedelic drugs for spiritual transcendence or consciousness expansion, he stood out among others and provides a particularly illustrative example of the counterculture's legitimation of drug use as a tool for religious experience because of the extent of the acceptance of his ideology concerning hallucinogens. As Theodore Roszak said in the 1968 Nation piece, Leary had succeeded in convincing vast numbers of the young that dope is a sacrament that will put you in touch with the ancient 2 million year old wisdom inside you that will help you get back in tune with God's harmony. Leary's followers therefore tried to reconstruct the image of the drug user by framing it as a tool for gaining spiritual insight. Drugs became a method of religious experience rather than a deviant criminal action. Leary had thus successfully framed drug use as an intellectual and spiritual experience, and at least in his own and his followers' minds, gave it a sense of legitimacy and even normalcy. Counterculture's rebranding of drug use therefore signified a challenge to the traditional narrative on drug use and the image of the drug user as a dangerous social other. Members of the counterculture attempted to legitimize their drug use by various means, whether it was by framing it as a tool for spiritual awakening, by challenging the value system that insisted drugs were a cause of moral decay and criminality, or a combination of both. Their use of drugs exemplified their willingness to break a law that seemed to them hypocritical and unnecessary, and as a statement that they knew better than to believe what they had been told. The counterculture assigned a meaning to drug use that transposed the image of the drug user from the criminal to the spiritual, from lower-class minority to educated middle-class white, and thereby challenged the dialogue on drug use in the United States. Thus, rejecting traditional American cultural values was, by extension, a rejection of the anti-drug narrative that had dominated discussions of drug use for more than 3 decades and was firmly entrenched in American society and law. Drug use within the counterculture, therefore, was not just a habit, it was a manifestation of a set of attitudes about American society and the world. Moreover, it became an integral aspect of these people's lives, a part of themselves and their constructions of their identity. As a writer for the Middletown Times-Herald Record said, members of the counterculture had adopted drug use as a way of life, as a temporary escape from the unpredictable, constantly high-strung world of modern America, or as a means of pursuing their own private vision of reality, among other things. It functioned as a symbol of their beliefs and as a critique of the world in which they lived. Thus, it can be seen that the 1960s was indeed a unique period in the history of American drug use, as the meanings and symbolism of drug use would be forever altered, even if the hippies' own steadfast devotion to drugs as a way of life would fade within a decade. Although it is clear that the counterculture was characterized by its promotion of drugs as tools and symbols, the relationship of the counterculture with drugs in the 1960s is a complex one. Like other historical phenomena, drug use in the 1960s was complex and did not always adhere to an easily constructed model. Although what it meant exactly was contested by different groups of people from different segments of society, and the use of drugs could not and cannot be neatly packaged into a homogeneous framework, the use of drugs in the 1960s counterculture is nonetheless significant in that it had social, political, and cultural connotations. The spread of drug use in the 1960s and the changes in dialogue initiated by the users themselves was met with staunch resistance by those who still clung to the idea that drug use was inherently devious and dangerous, which serves to illustrate not only the degree to which anti-drug campaigns of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s had succeeded in creating anxiety over drug use, but also the dynamic and wide-ranging social meanings that it had in the context of the 1960s. The attitudes of those who opposed drug use were often heavily influenced by the image of the drug user crafted in the 1930s that linked criminality to the use of illegal drugs. As Richard Goldstein noted in a 1966 Saturday Evening Post article, opponents of the counterculture's use of drugs continue to argue that drugs sometimes incite the user to commit acts of violence, and often reference the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics' sensationalized list of murders, assaults, and robberies involving persons who were allegedly under the influence of marijuana when the crimes were committed. Indeed, a widespread criticism of marijuana especially was that it was a stepping stone to stronger addictive drugs such as heroin, causes damage to the body, twists the mind, leads to lust, violence, and crime, and produces moral decay. The attitudes of law enforcement officers are particularly illustrative of the social meaning attached to the use of drugs and the extent to which the image of the drug user as a dangerous social other was cemented in American psyche. One Washington, D.C. officer called the use of marijuana a deviant practice and argued that only fringe students are likely to be involved. Another officer in Seattle called counterculture drug users repulsive and abnormal. The district attorney from El Dorado County, California, Lloyd Hamilton, reiterated the claim that marijuana could lead to mental illness and said that users posed a danger to law enforcement because it caused them to become violent. In a 1968 article in the New Republic, Carl Bernstein quoted one officer as saying that hippies are quite a problem for this city. It's part of a moral breakdown. The dialogue condemning drug use in the 1960s was thus heavily influenced by the image of the drug user as a fundamentally dangerous social other constructed in the 1930s, demonstrating the extent to which this image continued to dominate anti-drug sentiment in the 1960s and beyond. The effects of the counterculture's use of drugs and the backlash of public anxiety and the crusade against it continue to influence American society far after the 1960s had wound down. When discussing the counterculture, or the 60s in general, it's difficult to avoid a discussion of drugs. Our collective memory of the hippie is still perhaps best characterized by the stereotypical counterculture youth, shaggy and unkempt, wearing bell-bottoms and tie-dye, clutching a marijuana cigarette or maybe staring into space in the midst of an acid trip. Psychedelic art, imagery, and clothing continue to be sold in numerous venues. The feelings of counterculture opponents remain too. It could be argued that the modern conservative political movement found its roots in opposition to those who cast out the traditional values and morals that conservatives still try to uphold today. The fears and anxiety over drug use continue to be rehashed in the public campaigns against drugs in the 1980s and are still alive and well today in TV commercials and public information campaigns that use vivid symbolism and frightening imagery to deter youth from drugs. It is no understatement to say that the social struggles of the 1960s have been and are significant to us even today. The ways in which drug use served as a conduit for expressing public viewpoints and had social, political, and cultural meanings illustrates how seemingly hollow actions can serve as symbols of ideological positions and cultural critiques. For the drug-using members of the counterculture, drugs functioned as symbols of their quest for life outside of mainstream American culture, were tools for spiritual enlightenment, manifestations of rebellion, and a challenge to years of anti-drug dialogue that portrayed users as criminal deviants. For conservatives who saw the counterculture and social upheavals of the 1960s as the breakdown of moral order, drugs were part of that breakdown and a symbol of deviance and degradation. Although drugs are an integral part of our collective memory of the counterculture, not enough attention has been devoted to what it meant to be a drug user in this era. Examining how something like drug use can have deep political, cultural, and social meaning can expand the focus of our views on human actions and provide further insight into how the activities of people in historical periods can have far-reaching significance.